tonight's topic is what Hartman calls the ethics of rebuke. I would kind of feel like to subtitle this, "Don't try this at home." I am struck that there are many times in our tradition, and particularly, well, probably when you talk about ethics, but where there's sort of this aspirational ideal, or this aspirational idea of how you create a utopian society. And so it's also really, I think, thinks about people who live amongst each other and don't really ever travel beyond their village, unless, God forbid, they have to flee. But that people live amongst each other for generations, households, children live close to home, if adult children, if not even within the home. And so there is constantly, and we see this in the Torah all the time, these sort of goals to get people to live together in a society that cares for one another, that knows each other intimately, and talks a lot about what happens when inevitably human beings bump up against each other and don't get along, things don't go well, and how do you even attempt to smooth that over? So last week we spoke about, what happens if you see somebody's lost animal, right? You can't turn away. You have to take your time out of your busy day to stop and return the animal. And then acknowledges even worse than that, but what if your enemy needs help? And they're not thinking of your enemy, though. Well, I would say, I don't think they're thinking of your enemy that, you're Ukrainian and you see, your Russian enemy's donkey fell and you have to help them up. Like, I don't think they're thinking about enemy in that way. I think they're really thinking about another Israelite. Since it's the Torah, it would be, the proper phrase would be Israelite, right? To be your brethren, someone you live next to, your neighbor, who also happens to be your enemy. So the sources that we're going to look at tonight think about what happens when somebody does something that really bothers you. What is the best way to try and address it? And I think about this a lot, about, really the society that we are living in today, which is so divided. And I would think in many ways it really kind of feels tribal, in a way that I'm not so sure previous generations in the United States would have experienced in the same way. But maybe other countries and other people in other times would have known that kind of a reality, where people sort of revert to their own, though I don't know, maybe our grandparents felt very tribal with other Jewish people. So I'm not sure that, maybe I'm just looking through the distorted lens of really worrying about where our society is. Several years ago, I was at an AIPAC conference and they showed a diagram that I thought was very interesting. Talked about voting patterns. So it showed Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And the chart looked like you had, Democrats, you had Republicans, and then you had independents. And it was very, it looked like this, like it was intermixed. If you look today at the same chart, 30, 40 years later, the chart kind of looks like this. It's so strongly Democrat and Republican, with just maybe a teeny little overlap between what we used to think of as an independent voter. And so the idea that I think that we had for most of our society is that if you could just talk to somebody, right? If you could just talk to them and you would explain your views and they would explain their views, and maybe you would agree to disagree, but there was the possibility that through dialogue, you would be able to convince people that your side was right, that was a possibility. I think they used to call it, two men seeking after truth, because obviously they conceived of this as a male endeavor. That's much harder today. That is much harder today as we fall into our political camps and our political sides and our tribal units. But nonetheless, the sources that we're going to look at tonight encourage us to think about what happens, how do we deal with somebody, not just somebody that we disagree with, but somebody that has actually hurt us or harmed us in some way. So hopefully you have these sources in front of you, but I will put them up on the screen. So some of us looked at these verses together, I think it was 2 Shabbatot ago. They're in Parshat Kedoshim, in the Torah portion, Kedoshim, which begins, you shall be holy, for God is holy. And then there are a lot of laws that deal with our proper behavior. So within that Parsha, you shall not hate your fellow in your heart. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of him. So let's just stop there for a minute. So according to this verse, if you want to not hate your neighbor in your heart, what is it that you should do? It's not a trick question. It's in the verse. Do you want me to put it back on the screen? Okay. It's hard because we haven't solved the issue of why I can't see all of you when my screen is up. So you shall not hate your fellow in your heart. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of them. So what do you think? And I can't see because I can't see everybody. If your hand is up, I might not see you. So what do you think this verse means? What is it that you're supposed to do? Ron. Sorry, you need to unmute. Ron, you need to unmute.
It doesn't sound like a word that would indicate a conciliation. It seems to me that it would enhance the animosity.
Yeah, that's why I said the subtext is.
I have no idea.
Right. That's why I said the subtext of this is don't try this at home. Rebuke is, I hate to say, call the Torah strange, but rebuke seems to be a very strange word. And it is in Hebrew, it's tochach. It is a harsh word that the Torah chooses. And I don't know if it had a more nuanced meaning in its time, because we would think that, somebody does something that bothers you. So let's put rebuke aside for a moment and say that a different word might have been chosen. What is the Torah encouraging you to do if you are angry at somebody? Yeah, Kate?
It seems as if this verse says you should confront that person.
Right. So you should tell them what's bothering you, right? Like we might say in a gentle tone of voice, honey, when you do this thing again. But the Torah basically says, if we can put rebuke aside, that if somebody does something that really makes you hate them in your heart, you need to speak to them and tell them. Because otherwise, that could lead to some really bad outcomes. So it's interesting. What do you think the Torah means when it says, and not bear sin because of them? Like, this is not the clearest verse, but what do you think it means? Not bear sin because of them, if you hate them in your heart. I mean, minimally, it could lead you to some really, and we're going to see another verse in a minute, could lead, if you really hate somebody, chances are it's not going to just stay secretly in your heart, right? It may cause you to act in ways that will be sinful. So better to clear the air, get it all out. And now remember, this isn't the only verse about human interaction in the Torah, right? Like, we know, for example, at Yom Kippur, we're told in rabbinic literature that in order to gain forgiveness on Yom Kippur, that you can only atone for your sins on Yom Kippur, your sins to God. But your sins that you've committed to other human beings, in order to gain atonement, you have to go and apologize, right? You have to go and make amends. So perhaps if you are being scrupulous, if everybody's being scrupulous about making amends for ways that they've hurt or harmed other people, perhaps you also have a group of people that can take it when you say, this thing that you did was hurtful or harmful. If it feels like you're living with people where it's sort of a two-way street and everybody's kind of giving and taking. Barb?
Does this verse imply that hating in your heart is not enough to rise to the level of sin? Does it presume that you're going to take some action in furtherance of that? Sounds like, Jimmy Carter lusting in his heart too.
Right, we talked about this Sunday night. Yeah, it is possible. It is possible that the verse means that hating someone in your heart is a sin. I mean, Judaism doesn't tend to go that way. We talked about this Sunday night for those that were there. I don't know how we ended up on this topic when we were talking about abortion. That when Jimmy Carter said he lusted in his heart and he sinned in his heart, that the Jewish response to that is that's ridiculous. Like, we don't really care, Jimmy. Like, could you keep it to yourself? That what you think in your heart is not considered a sin. But it's possible that this verse implies that, that Judaism is not so clearly delineated, that it's possible that if you hate somebody in your heart, that is considered a sin. But it's also quite possible, and certainly rabbinic tradition interprets it in that it will lead you to bad action. And we'll see the verse that follows it in a minute in the Torah that leads them to say that. Paul?
I'll be honest with you, I really had a hard time kind of figuring out what the passage meant. Right. Your explanation, though, it kind of reminds me a little bit of a theory of social work in my training that was called collecting stamps. That every time you have sort of this encounter that's bad, you put a stamp in your book, and eventually that book's going to explode because it's got so many stamps in it. So that's something that just came to my mind from what you just said.
Well, look, in the world of therapy, you would be encouraged to find a way to express what it is that the other person did to you. If they harmed you, or upset you in some way, rebuke is, I think, what makes this verse so problematic, because no therapist would say, you go and you tell them that they may never, ever treat you like that. But in order to not carry all this stuff around, all these bad feelings, and the Torah says hatred or whatever it is, there is a way of encouraging people to learn to speak to somebody, to tell them, to try to clear the air and to try to let go of some of this stuff. And our tradition also does emphasize very much the apologizing and taking responsibility for your actions. But let's look at the continuation of the very next verse in the Torah. And this is why that the rabbis link the idea of sin not to just what you're thinking, that you hate somebody in that sin. But
Rabbi,
yes,
I have to interrupt you. Just 1 second
Yeah,
to
sure.
ask. Is it possible that there's a more alternative translation of the Hebrew word so that you don't have to use rebuke?
Well, the Hebrew is quite emphatic. It's hocheach tochiach. You shall surely rebuke. And tochacha is rebuke. Like when God, there are many, many, many verses in the Torah where God says, if you sin, these are going to be your punishment. And it's tochacha. It is very clearly in the Torah, a very strong word. So I think, as I said, I think that's what it feels very problematic to us. The idea that you would actually rebuke another human being, though, you know, I mean, you'll see in a moment, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge. It's possible, you know, that, I mean, we're thinking, you know, what did this person do that you need to rebuke them? You know, did they hurt your feelings by saying something thoughtless? Or did they really do something that's worthy of being rebuked? They really did something bad, and therefore they need to know that they did something bad. And so the verse doesn't really tell us, but the Hebrew is very strong. So, and then
We
the very
can't squirm out of it on the basis of a translation.
oh, but I'm gonna say the Hebrew is really strong.
Okay.
It doesn't say you shall gently mention in passing in a way in a therapist's office with professional present. Like it really is, you shall surely rebuke is the actual translation. So, but again, you know, you got to kind of imagine what is, you know, something that would be bad enough that would be, so that somebody would need to be taken to task for. And you know, I don't know, we'd have to think of an example of something that was bad enough that wasn't criminal, but was bad enough that you needed to really let them know, like you can't, don't do this anymore. Listen, you know, we probably all have stories of music played too loud in the middle of the night, dogs that are left outside barking all night, like things that people that live next door to you do that are really over time, not minor things that can really make your living situation so unpleasant that it's not just, you know, some little minor thing, but something that makes it really hard, and it's not always illegal.
Mhm.
So some people know that we had a really icky border dispute with our neighbors when they moved in. This was a long time ago, and it was a very expensive resolution. But in any case, this is like so stupid. This is really stupid. But so we don't really like them, right? Where they stay on their side of the fence, we stay on our side of the fence. It was, you know, it was a lot of money and legal expenses to resolve this issue. In any case, one day I'm sitting by my pool and I smell this horrible smell coming from their property. And this goes on for like days, and I don't really know what to do about it. And so eventually I called the police, and I'm thinking the police are going to come to my house. They're going to see me sitting by my pool and be like, oh, you know, you rich suburban woman. Oh, there's a bad smell. Oh, I'm so sorry. But as it turns out, our neighbors they have a pond on their property, and they hooked up, in order to save money or whatever, they hooked up their sprinkler system to the pond. So they were spraying pond water, when, you know, pond water has that like icky, stagnant water smell, all over their lawn. And it really did smell. And guess what? In Highland Park, you're not allowed to do that. So they went over there and told them, and they had to unhook their sprinkler system from their pond. And I'm sure they really, really like us even less after that. But, you know, that's why we have things like zoning laws and things that in theory, you know, you can't blow your leaf blower at, you know, 4 o'clock in the morning. But, you know, the Torah and Rabbinic Judaism are beginning to codify for the Israelites the civic law and how people live together. And they don't necessarily have a police force that can come over and tell you to unhook your pond water, right? So the question is how do you deal with the fact that people that are living around you are doing things that are really making you angry? So as I said, I think rebuke, you know, is a very strong word, but I think they're dealing with situations that aren't just mildly unpleasant, but could make living together so bad. And then, as I said, the very next verse would lead you to want to take vengeance, right? So you shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against your fellow citizens. And then probably one of the most famous verses of the Torah that you might not have known came with these verses. Rather, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So you probably didn't know that a verse that talks about loving your neighbor is preceded by 2 verses that talk about what happens when your neighbor does things that are really bad, that really, really, really bother you. Well, in order to be able to love your neighbor and not hate them in your heart, you have to be able to find a way to tell them what they're doing that's making you so angry, so that you don't get to a place where you want to, you've probably heard this story too, that these same neighbors, I told you the story last week, that the dog that came on the property and and you're supposed to return your enemy's animal, I guess I actually, could have also taken vengeance. So I could have been in violation of multiple Torah laws at one time about dealing with my neighbor by not returning their lost animal and bearing a grudge and taking vengeance. So I wouldn't say I don't actually hate them in my heart. Like, enough time has passed by. They stay on their side, we stay on our side. We don't interact, and we have big properties, and it's not a problem. I'm really, really, really nice to my other neighbors, and they like me a lot because for my own psyche, I have to feel like, I'm a good neighbor. So, so there are all, but we all, I think Ron shared a story with us, that we all understand what it's like to live amongst other human beings and how very, very difficult that is. So let's look at a few more verses. So here's another thing though. So I'm giving you these dramatic examples of your, neighbors that are really, annoying neighbors. But I think this is not talking about that. I think this is really talking about not your neighbor, but family members, friends, other people, right? You shall not hate your brother in your heart. Oh, this is really important. The Hebrew of you shall not hate your fellow. I hadn't hadn't noticed that when I was looking at the word for rebuke, achicha. The word is it's translated as your fellow because it wants to be, broad, but it is, but the actual word is your brother, right? So somebody really could be a brother, could be your family member. It could be a fellow Israelite. Doesn't have to be your biological family, but your brother, right? Someone that is really close to you. And, we won't even get into, sibling relationships, which are, which can also be very fraught. So you shall not hate your brother in your heart. If someone has done bad to you, do not behave if you continue to love them all the time, setting an ambush for them in your heart. Such an attitude is unhealthy, but rather you shall rebuke them for what they have done, and through that there shall be peace. So the Rashbam lived about 1,000 years ago. So, maybe we would call this a precursor, to modern therapy, right? Pretending that you love them when you actually can't stand them is unhealthy, right? Better, you should get to a place where you can confront them. Let's use the word confront instead of rebuke. It's nicer than, it's nicer than rebuke. It's probably truer to the word than saying, and you should find a nice way to tell them, right? You should confront them. And then if you can actually find a way to talk it out, you hopefully could get to a place of a peaceful resolution. So let's just stop there. Like, what do you think? Yes, Ron.
Well, I think there has to be a neutral area. I remember one Yom Kippur where you gave a very inspiring sermon about getting along with your neighbor. And I went to my neighbor who was a problem for almost everybody in my block. And he slugged me when I got to his door and I said, Dennis, let's try to get together and start anew. And he slugged me. I had to have him arrested. And I think now I thought of maybe I had to exert the neutral, just ignore him and not try to make him a part of our community. Nobody else did, but I listened to you. Nobody else was
It
there
hurt too
listening
badly.
to you from my street, but I thought, you know what? I think that's a damn good idea, and I'm gonna go talk to him. Twice he tried to run me over in the street, and he was obviously a little bit of a problem, maybe an emotional problem too, that I never recognized.
Look, that's
At
part of
any
the
rate,
problem
I
is we don't know if there are people that have mental illness, people that are violent, that are walking amongst us, which is now, if you have a problem with your neighbor, spraying smelly pond water all
Well,
over,
finally
call
resolved.
somebody else to deal with it,
I
right?
filed a lawsuit against him. Being a lawyer, it was inexpensive, but it wasn't inexpensive for him.
Right.
And I filed a civil lawsuit against him for a myriad of activities that were nuisances, like flooding my backyard and things of that sort.
Right.
And he finally stopped being a nuisance.
Look,
But
that's the thing in our society today that you
we
might
never
need.
became friends.
You
I
might need
just
somebody
think
else to mediate
couldn't
the
happen.
issue if your neighbor has violent tendencies. Eileen?
And this wasn't a neighbor situation, but it was a group that we belonged to where there was a serious disagreement between previous members of a board and the current members of the board. And rather than we were hoping that they would let the Bet Din resolve it. But they said no, and they went to Cook County and filed suit against the board.
Look, that's why I said the Torah is really aspirational in so many ways, right? Of feeling that there is a way to create this utopian society, right? We just read this past Shabbat, you're leaving the corners of your fields for the poor to come and glean. There's the Torah, every 7th year we leave the land fallow so that it, can rejuvenate itself, and you're allowed to pick whatever grows naturally, but you don't, plant and sow. And wouldn't that be lovely, right? That you could just say, we're going to take a year off, let the earth rest, So the Torah has this very utopian ideal. Unfortunately, we've yet to reach it because human beings are far more difficult and complicated. Jerry? Wait, you were unmuted. Now you just muted.
Okay. Unfortunately, not all things are reconcilable. I don't know if the Torah talks about having a third person, such as a mediator, perhaps come in and resolve the issue. That would be fair to both parties.
Well, if it's like a lawsuit, it does, right? There are judges, and
Right.
there are ways, but so yes, I mean, there is, the Torah talks a lot about setting up judges wherever you live. And the Mishnah and the Talmud has a million examples, right? Two people come in with a talit and they both say it's mine, and how you determine who it belongs to and how do you divide things fairly. But not everything rises to the level of a lawsuit. So, but yes, I mean, when it comes to anything that would go to a court of law, then there's quite a bit of literature on that. But this, I think that, doesn't rise to that. This is the things that people do thoughtlessly, or maybe not even, that just really hurt you or bother you, that make you really hate them. I shared the story, I think it was when we were talking about 2 weeks ago at synagogue about not bearing a grudge. Then I think everybody has these stories in their family, but my mother used to tell me, that seating charts at weddings and simchas in our family were a nightmare, because she had, 3 aunts that didn't speak to each other. Like there were 2 sister-in-laws and a sister, right? That didn't speak to each other. And, how did you seat people? Because this one wouldn't sit with this one would sit with this one, but she wouldn't sit with that one. So, the whole seating chart had to revolve around like not putting these 3 sister-in-laws at the same table. And I think lots of families have stories like that, right? So the Torah is trying to talk about, like, how do you stop it before it gets that far? And it would be nice, as I said, it would be very nice that if you said to somebody, this thing that you're doing really hurts me or really bothers me, and they say, oh my God, I had no idea you were so sensitive. No, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I apologize. I won't do it anymore. And then they don't, and you all live happily ever after. And sometimes that happens. Like sometimes, in relationships that happens. With people that you love, that people, they didn't know, or they did know, but now they're going to try to stop. So it's not like it never happens, that you can never resolve anything, that you can never, I don't want to paint this picture that you can never talk to anybody about what's bothering you and never have some sort of a happier ending. So that's what the Torah is hoping for. But, as I said, it's delicate. It's a very delicate situation. All right, let's look at another source. So this is a source, a midrashic source that's about 2,000 years old, and they're trying to apply it. And in this case, they're really trying to apply it amongst Torah scholars, right? So these are the people that you are spending time with, both in a yeshiva learning situation and also ruling on Jewish law. So these rabbis, and Rabbi Akiva, you may recognize his name. Most of these rabbis were eventually killed by the Romans. So these were all rabbis that were teaching during the time after the Roman conquest of Israel, under Roman rule. If you remember that the study of Torah, the teaching of Torah was forbidden, and they continued to study and teach Torah. And over time, they were all killed, we would say martyred, by the Romans. And we read about this on Yom Kippur. So much of our great rabbinic literature, the earliest generation of rabbinic literature, the Mishnaic generation of rabbinic literature, was written and influenced by these rabbis that were eventually killed by the Romans. And they're living or trying to live. And if you think that that we're trying to create ideal societies in our neighborhoods, they are really trying to create this ideal society in the study house, and that saying, I mean, this wasn't a rabbinic saying of, you know, men seeking after truth, right? These are rabbis that are seeking to interpret and determine Jewish law. It's the transition really from biblical law to the beginning of the rabbinic era. They're watching their country being overrun. They are watching Jews leave Eretz Yisrael and go to Babylonia. They're trying to set law for Israel. And then we also have rabbis that are trying to interpret Jewish law outside of Israel, since all of Jewish law of the Torah was meant to be applied in Israel. And they disagree all the time. There are different interpretations of law. They disagree all the time, and they're trying to figure out a way to disagree without being disagreeable. And I've asked like lawyers this before, lawyers that that try cases in court, right? That you have people that are in this situation in court, you know, the prosecuting lawyer and the defending lawyer, that's quite adversarial, right? They're each trying to win for their client or whatever. And I'm like, are you friends afterwards? Like when you walk out of court, like, are you still friends? Do you go out to dinner? Like, do you, and most of the people that I asked, they're like, yeah, we do. Like that we understand that while we're in court, this is our job, but that it's not personal, right? It's not personal. And maybe sometimes not everybody always feels that way. But certainly these rabbis are trying to figure out, and so how to, you know, create this society that while they disagree, they're not disagreeable. But Rabbi Tarfon says, in this generation, there's no one who can administer tochacha. Nobody knows how to do it right, right? There's a whole, all these great scholars, they have no idea. Clearly it's not working, right? It's not working. And why is it not working? Because the people that are saying it are not doing it in the right way. Elazar ben Azariah disagrees with him and says, no, the problem is there's no one that can accept it. So let's just stop there for a minute. So what's the issue? These great scholars can't agree.
Add something.
I'm sorry, start again. I didn't hear you.
Well, I think you might find it interesting. The resolution with this next door neighbor with whom I had such difficulty and with whom the entire block had such difficulty ended in a very interesting way. I insisted that as a condition of dismissing the criminal charges against him, that we arranged to go to the village of Wilmette and have some mediator. And this fellow was extremely brilliant, a mediator. And he started the meeting with, he asked my neighbor, what is it you want of Ron? And then he asked, after Dennis spoke, he asked me, what did I want of Dennis? And we were able to walk away from that meeting, having spoken to one another, not to be great friends and going out for dinner together, but at least having had the opportunity to find out what was going on, to create the animosity and tension that was constantly so obvious. So this mediation with a good mediator is a remarkably wonderful process.
So maybe that, you know, so that's, you know, the really, you need a professional, right? You need professional help. That's why family members very often talk about these things in a therapist's office, where you have a third party that's professionally trained to help you have the conversation and, you know, keep the, you know, the tension down and the, you know, so that people don't say more things that they might regret. But it's interesting to look at a text where you have rabbis disagreeing, because we have every text we have has rabbis disagreeing. The entire Talmud is about rabbis disagreeing. But what are they disagreeing about here? Why is the system of rebuking not working? So you have one great rabbi that says, because people aren't doing it right, they don't know how to do it. And then you have another great rabbi saying, no, it's because people don't know how to take it. Like, so whose fault is it? Like the people that are doing it or the people that are receiving it? And so there's a debate about, hold on, that was the wrong screen. Let me just show you again. So Rabbi Akiva says, in this generation, there was no one who knows how to administer. So Rabbi Akiva is agreeing with Rabbi Tarfon that people don't know how to do it. And then Rabbi Yochanan has a little story. I call heaven and earth as witness. More than 4 or 5 times was Akiva punished by Rabban Gamliel, who was the head of we'll call it the yeshiva, due to me, because I complained about him. Yet I knew that nevertheless he increased his love towards me. So now this is open to interpretation, right? Rabbi Akiva is saying it's the people don't know how to administer it. Now, Rabbi Yochanan is giving an example that agrees with Rabbi Akiva, right? That Rabbi Akiva knows how to take it. That's what he's saying. And people might not be administering it, but Rabbi Akiva knows how to take it. But he reveals this interesting story about himself. 4 or 5 times Akiva was punished for what he did because I complained about him to the head of the yeshiva, and he was punished. But I know that Akiva still, not only does he loves me even more. Now, we don't hear Akiva's reaction to this. Maybe he really does, because he was a great, great, great rabbi. But this is an interesting example of Akiva says people don't know how to administer it, but people do. But he was the victim of having it be administered to him many, many times. And clearly he knew how to take it, as far as we know. So, at the end, the great Rabbi Akiva is shown as an example of someone who has been rebuked multiple times and doesn't hate the person. As a matter of fact, loves the person, welcomes the person. Well, we don't know if he, welcomed, but let's say he learned from the rebuke, and whatever it was that he was doing, stopped doing it. Now, this probably was not. This was probably regarding to, maybe some behavior, but it could also have been regarding the way he was interpreting Jewish law. We do have stories of people not, Rabban Gamliel was actually, we have many stories of him being harsh. And we know at one point he was replaced as the leader of the yeshiva because he was harsh, of the Sanhedrin, because he was harsh, and kinder, more compassionate rabbi was put in his place. But nonetheless, this is an example of scholars that are at least trying to follow this law in the Torah of figuring out how one confronts other people, and who is, if it's not being received well, who is at fault, the person that's giving it or the person who's taking it. And the great rabbis probably come down on the side that it's the problem is the people that are doing it aren't doing it right. So what do you think? Ron, I don't know if you have your hand up newly from before or if you put your hand up again. And you're muted, so I can't tell if you're talking to Ruth or you're trying to talk to us. No, okay. What do you think? Application in real life, Torah ideal? What do you think? Well, I'll share something. I think Kate might have seen it already because she was there on Shabbat when I gave it. But I'll show you a cute. Well, I think it's kind of cute. But it's the Rashi on the verse that says, "You shall not avenge and you shall not bear a grudge." So since we're looking at that verse, I thought it would be nice to look at. So what does that mean, right? What does that mean? What could that mean in practical terms? And Rashi gives an example. So what is a way that you shouldn't avenge your neighbor? If one says to another, "Lend me your sickle," and he replies no, and the next day the latter says to the former, "Lend me your hatchet," and he retorts, I'm not going to lend it to you just as you've refused to lend it, your sickle to me, that's avenging. So what's avenging? Well, you didn't do something for me, I'm not going to do something for you. So you're not supposed to do that, right? You're just supposed to put aside that your neighbor, didn't loan you his tool, and you're supposed to just, forget about that. He needs something. You're just supposed to be as helpful as you can. So that's avenging. But what's bearing a grudge? If one says to another, lend me your hatchet, and he replies no, and on the next day he says to him, lend me your sickle, and he replies, here it is. So that's what you're supposed to do, right? But you're not supposed to say, I am not like you, because you would not lend me. So you're not supposed to say to somebody, you're not supposed to say, I won't lend to you because you didn't lend to me. That's vengeance. But what's bearing a grudge? You're not supposed to say, I will lend to you, even though you didn't lend to me. So you're not supposed to do that, right? Now, I don't know how that goes with rebuking, right? Like rebuking would be finding a better way to say, look, it really yesterday, interesting that you're here today, because yesterday I asked for your help and you didn't help me, but now today you're here for my help. Now I want to help you, but it would be really nice if the next time I go to ask you for help, you also help me. That's would be much more, so perhaps that's, different than saying it like in a way that's like, I'm better than you because I'm not going to act in the bad way that you acted. So I like that Rashi brought this very sort of down to earth example of behavior that one could
It's something like Donald Trump. You help me, I'll help you.
Well, right. Listen, for most of us, Donald Trump was 5, maybe 6 years of a lesson in how not to behave in a civil manner. And I think the thing that most of us shook our heads about for 6 years was, why do generally Republicans not care about this behavior? And more specifically, religious Christians, why do they not care about this behavior? Probably the simple answer is because they got their Supreme Court. But it was hard to understand for most of us how people could not just turn a blind eye to bad behavior, but could not see how this coarsened all discourse in the United States and how it harmed the office of the president and respect for the office of the president. And I don't know that I don't know. I don't know. I feel like I will say, the one thing I will say, as scared as I am about the future of our country and the upcoming elections and all of that, and there are many things that I would say that President Biden does that I'm not super happy with. Not living at that level of outrage at the presidency every day. I at first I was very, very grateful for it. Now I kind of just take it for granted, but I have to stop and remind myself how much better it is without the daily outrage of the tweet, of the behavior, of that constant. I mean, there's plenty to be constantly upset about, but without that added horribleness of what did he do today? What did he say today? There is, I'm grateful for that respite. I pray it lasts into the next administration. We'll see. But I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. And I think the thing that I really struggle with as a rabbi and as a Jew is, how do you look at people or deal with people who you feel that their politics, and they of course feel this way about us too, is destroying our country, how do you balance that with, giving people a benefit of the doubt and a fair hearing? And we all have to still live together. And we're fortunate in our community, particularly at Am Yisrael, that people are so politically like-minded. But my friends that are rabbis in Florida and Texas, where their congregations are very divided between Trump supporters and we'll call them Biden supporters or Democratic Party supporters, between vaxxers and anti-vaxxers, to try to keep this community together it's very difficult. And I've talked to Lonnie Nassar about this, and even our federation is struggling. Between, we don't experience it so much at Am Yisrael, but there are a fair number of Chicago area Jews that are Republican Trump supporters, and to try to keep the community together. It's really hard. And I don't think rebuking is the answer, and so it depends what happened. But I sway in this pendulum between trying to give people the benefit of the doubt and feeling that they're destroying democracy. So I don't know,
There are groups, there are strong groups in the South who wish to succeed from the Union. That's their aim, as is the Palestinians to remove Israel. These folks feel as strongly about removing the South from the United States. And there's many organizations in the South that are still clinging to the Confederate heroes.
Yeah. Look, we get all the cities though. That's the problem, right? That's the problem. Well, it's not the problem. We don't really want to see, the United States divide into two countries. But many years ago, James Carvell said about Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania is Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and the rest is Alabama. And that's true of every single state in the Union. It's certainly true of Illinois. So it's, it'd be, if there was a sense that there was a border and you could split, and but that APEC thing, like it's not like that. It's blue and red is mixed together. Almost every city in the country is blue, surrounded by the rest of their state that's red. So even if we would want to split, we can't really split. And I don't know, like I don't know, where this is all gonna end.
The assimilation of diversity will, in decades ahead, solve the problem.
So they say, right? That's what they say. I hope so. I hope that's true. I am equally concerned about identity politics on the left. And I don't know that that's doing, that's also not doing a disservice. I was listening to NPR today, and people talking about the aftermath of Buffalo. And I was listening to a Black professor talk about, which is, critical race theory, which is part of the belief of critical race theory, is that the history of the United States is racist and founded on racism, and racism permeates every single institution in this society. And therefore, almost everything has to be torn down and rebuilt. And I think that's very dangerous. I think that's very dangerous. And I think not to acknowledge that, yes, every society is built on racism. Can you name one society that's not built on racism, on anti-Semitism? But to tear down all of the good things that this country was started with, that were so forward thinking, like, so I don't know. I'm really, really worried about, and as Jews, I'm super worried about the right and the left, It's very interesting in the aftermath of Buffalo, the people that want to talk about white supremacy and say, you know, Charleston, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, right? White supremacists and their attack on, but I heard speakers today also talk about Charleston and Buffalo and this Asian church and not mention Pittsburgh. And so my question is, do they not mention Pittsburgh because they don't understand that anti-Semitism is part of this white supremacist package? Or do they purposely not mention Pittsburgh because it happened to whites who happen to be Jewish and are not people of color? And I don't know. I didn't stay for question and answer. That's the only problem with NPR. I listen to it in my car and then I don't, you know, I'm gone before the end of the show. So I didn't, you know, get to dial in and ask my question if, you know, if Pittsburgh was purposefully left out. And then I'm also cautious, like, let's not make this all about us. This was, you know, racist crime in Buffalo. But I am still, and it's a generational thing, but I am still a believer in we should all be allying together, and the way that we ally together is not to leave certain people out. So I don't know, except for the, you know, I'll say one last thing, which has nothing to do with rebuke, but right after Trump was elected, I was invited to go on this trip to Israel called Encounter, which takes Jewish leaders to the West Bank to meet with all different kinds of Palestinians, and just to really listen to their narrative, not to argue, just to listen. And we heard some really, really rough things. You know, people that felt that suicide bombing is a legitimate form of resistance. You know, we heard some things that were really, really harsh and not really that hopeful, frankly. And I thought to myself when I came home, as hard as this listening tour was, I was more inclined to go to a listening tour of Palestinians on the West Bank if somebody had invited me to, at that point, after Trump was elected, if somebody had invited me to go on a listening tour in Alabama to sit and listen to Trump supporters, I don't know if I would have gone. Like, I think I could go now. Enough time has passed, but I don't think that, and I thought, wow, yeah, it's really interesting. Like, it's interesting, like, to note how hard that would be. And I struggle with that because I think it's wrong of me, but it's very hard. So that, I don't know, that this is true confessions. But you asked me about Trump.
And the fact that you mentioned Pittsburgh in all of the mass shootings that we've encountered, because I've always felt, despite I know the Black community has its own problems, that they've never been as supportive of Jewish problems as I would have liked.
Yeah, I think that's a bigger problem now than it ever was. I think it's, they say, because we're white and we're beneficiaries of white privilege, and the Black Lives Matter movement and people like that have some really harsh philosophies on how they see the Jewish community. And it's hard, it's harsh, it's hard to listen to that too. But this great replacement, listen, there are things that are purely racist that have nothing to do with us as Jews and don't connect with anti-Semitism. And we shouldn't be seeing, you know, anti-Semitism. We can look at things that are really purely racist against the Black community and want to help, and not say, what about us? You know, what about us? But in this issue of this great replacement theory, they blame Jews. In these groups of white supremacists, there is a direct connection between anti-Semitism and racism. And so when we talk about this form of white supremacy, in Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us, there is a connection, and it would be better for all of us to work together to form, you know, to be allies. But it doesn't mean that every time something racist happens that we have to, you know, say, don't forget about anti-Semitism. Like, it depends. It's situational. But white supremacy in our country is targeting both Blacks and Jews and other people of color. And I do think we would be much better off when somebody's talking about what happened in Buffalo and talking about other incidents of white supremacists that Pittsburgh should be recognized. So whatever. All right. This was really a downer class. Good night. See you next week.